28 years later, The Bone Temple takes an ambitious step for the franchise that I think is ultimately necessary to complete the trilogy that they're shooting for. A January release, kind of a scary time for a movie to come out, but 28 years later, The Bone Temple is definitely breaking the January film release curse. This movie is very good. Releasing only 28 weeks later after 28 years later came out in June of last year. 28 years later, The Bone Temple is a filmed back-to-back sequel of that movie where Ralph Fiennes reprises his role as Dr. Kelson, Jack O'Connell reprises his role as Jimmy Crystal, you see Spike being played by Alfie Williams again, you have Chai Lewis Perry coming back as the Alpha in this, and in an expanded role in this movie, Erin Kellyman plays one of the Jimmy figures, and she does great. There's a lot of continuation of this story where you could expect it to go a certain direction, but Nia DaCosta, I think, takes it in a direction that is more of an ambitious step. You can tell that this movie is directed by Nia DaCosta and not Danny Boyle. While that's a good thing for me, it might not be a good thing for everybody else who is maybe more of a personal fan of this franchise. I like this franchise. I think it's very good, but I'm not as in tune with it as others. I still gave 28 years later a 3.5. I gave 28 days a 4. When you just look into Jamie, played by Aaron Taylor Johnson, and Isla, played by Jodie Comer, and Spike, played by Alfie Williams, you look at their lives and it's just about them surviving and them growing as a community. I'm going to interject myself. I misspoke. I think Spike and Jamie's character, dad and son, that relationship is what I expected out of the 28 years later franchise and the sequel, The Bone Temple. But when you see the relationship between son and mom, Spike and Isla, that's more of a lens of where you could expect The Bone Temple to go. And I'm glad that that is the direction that it ended up taking. It's a coming of age story for Spike, and you see that coming of age story continue to get fleshed out in 28 years later, The Bone Temple, where Spike is on his own and he's saved by the Jimmy clan, if you will, the seven fingers of Jimmy, where it's Jack O'Connell and his disciples, essentially, at the end of 28 years later. And you see that storyline pick up again at the beginning of 28 years later, The Bone Temple. And the biggest difference for me between 28 years later and the 28 years later, The Bone Temple, is I find the latter much more driven by the humans, less about the conflict of the zombie outbreak, the rage virus, the infection. 28 years later is pretty much dependent on, yep, these are humans having to go venture and go kill zombies, essentially. And that's totally fine. It's what the crux of the entire franchise is how do you continue to survive? How do you live on? But I found it much more interesting and engaging when you get to see a more fleshed out world that Nia DaCosta brings in 28 years later, The Bone Temple, where you have Dr. Ian Kelson, played by Ralph Fiennes, who is reprising his role from 28 years later. He's here in The Bone Temple and he's back and he's better than ever. Jack O'Connell as Jimmy Crystal is back and better than ever. Spike is awesome. I am so impressed with Alfie Williams, the actor, as Spike in these two movies. I blown away by his performances. I think he is incredible. He sometimes has the survival instincts of a toddler, but that's okay. He's young. He doesn't know the war-torn world, but he's growing up, and that's the whole point of his characters, to show that he can survive, and now he's going to be even stronger and more able to survive because of the events that happened to him. And the best parts about 28 years later, The Bone Temple, are when these two plot lines collide, where Spike goes away from Kelson at the end of 28 years later, and then Spike is then found by the Jimmy group, and he then has to join them or else he dies. And then you know that these plot lines are going to come back to one another at some point in this movie. And Kelson is over here playing the medicine man for Samson, an alpha infected zombie, and he's trying to get to the root of how the virus really works, how the rage virus actually impacts the human body, the brain, everything for it. And it's this really interesting relationship that is developed, and I think it's a good look into the ideas of science and medicine, but also kind of like unchecked power from the perspective of Kelson. Like, should he really be experimenting on Samson? Like, how much of his life is it worth to continue to experiment on this? And he tests the limits of that pretty extensively in 28 Years Later, The Bone Temple. But the best parts of this are the unchecked youth, the unchecked religion, the unchecked following of Jimmy Crystal and the Seven Fingers, and what that looks like as Jack O'Connell's portrayal as the villain in this movie. That to me was the most interesting part of, it's not just the humans surviving, it's why and how they're continuing to live. And you get two opposite viewpoints on how to survive. And when they collide at the, in the resolution and the climax of this film, it is this really interesting conversation about what is right, what is wrong, and the fact that there's probably not a right answer, and the shortcomings of both characters here, of Kelson and Jimmy Crystal in their respective situations. I think the steps that this movie takes pushes along a narrative that is much more interesting than just, yep, they're surviving a zombie apocalypse. And I think that I don't want to say a minority in that conversation as far as what my expectations are or how I expected this franchise to go, but I was not expecting something as ambitious of a take and a conversation to be had in 28 Years Later, The Bone Temple. And I don't know if it's because Nia DaCosta is directing and Danny Boyle didn't direct it. I don't know if it's Alex Garland just in the writer room, like this was the desired plan all along. But when I say that I was taken aback and caught off guard by the motivations that were presented in 28 Years Later, The Bone Temple, and that it could be a media literacy issue for me where I wasn't expecting this conversation to be had in this movie based on what I had seen previously in 28 Years Later, the movie prior to this. I think there's more interesting conversations in 28 Days Later than there are in 28 Years Later, but 28 Years Later, The Bone Temple takes that conversation to a whole new level. I know that horror can be an interesting genre to try and recommend to people. This movie is pretty gruesome. It is grotesque. There is a fair amount of gore. It is a zombie outbreak movie. This movie isn't going to be for everyone, but if you can stomach a bit of gore and you like deep, involved character, I think, exploration, you would like 28 Years Later, The Bone Temple, and I would recommend you see it. So that way we can get the finale of this trilogy and see where the story does finally end up. But thank you guys for watching this conversation about 28 Years Later and the franchise and The Bone Temple and my experience with it. I hope you guys enjoyed. Please subscribe if you are new. And remember, you should watch more movies. If you've seen this movie, you need to comment right now and let me know what your thoughts were on the Iron Maiden needle drop in this movie. I thought it was phenomenal.